Welcome to Noble Mind.
The Noble Mind podcast is brought to you by the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy.
Hello, I'm Dr. Kate King.
And I'm Alex Gökçe. In this episode, we talk to Dr. Ina Khazan about how to cope with emotional difficulties and enhance our performance using biofeedback and mindfulness.
Dr. Khazan is a faculty member at Harvard Medical School, where she teaches and supervises trainees. She's a clinical psychologist specializing in health psychology and performance training using biofeedback and mindfulness. She's recognized as a pioneer in mindfulness-based biofeedback and has conducted biofeedback and mindfulness trainings for notable institutions, including the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Army Special Forces, and the Stuttgart Opera and Ballet Company. She's the author of the highly regarded book, Clinical Handbook of Biofeedback, a step-by-step guide to training and practice with mindfulness, and the newly released book, Biofeedback and Mindfulness in Everyday Life, Practical Solutions for Improving Your Health and Performance.
You can get this episode's show notes, sign up to receive bonus content, and share your responses and suggestions at noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy the show.
Okay, so here we are talking with Ina Khazan. Thank you so much for being with us on Noble Mind today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we thought it probably would be a good place to start, as we often do, which is getting a sense of who you are and what you do and what got you into the work that you're doing now.
Certainly. So I'm a clinical health and performance psychologist. Which means I work with people who have various health issues, from high blood pressure to chronic pain to headaches to anxiety. And I also work with people who would like to improve their performance in professional, athletic, or artistic pursuits. People who wouldn't normally go see a psychologist for a clinical issue, but who have some things that they'd like to improve. So kind of, both sides of the same coin, the clinical and the just helping people do things better.
And how did you first get interested in health and performance psychology? Or, your book is Biofeedback and Mindfulness in Everyday Life. So another place would be, how'd you get into biofeedback or mindfulness?
Certainly. So I was training as a clinical health psychologist, and I was at doing a practicum at Cambridge Health Alliance, and they offered biofeedback training. I didn't know anything about biofeedback. It sounded cool. I took the training, and I loved it. It was really great. It helped so many people that I worked with who were struggling with psychophysiological disorders, like chronic pain and headaches and anxiety. It really provided them a way to have some mastery over their responses to the difficult stuff going on in their lives and happening to their bodies and minds. So it gave me a tool that was really practical, made a lot of sense for people. People were willing to use it, and it helped. But there were times when people would get stuck. For example, one of the biofeedback tools is hand warming. Teach people. This is particularly helpful for those who have migraines or have high blood pressure or anxiety. Right, I would be teaching people how to warm their hands. But as soon as people start trying to warm up the hands, like, am I doing this right? Is my finger temperature going up? Am I, imagining the right thing? Am I breathing the right way? And immediately the finger temperature would drop. The reason that happens is because any kind of effort, any kind of activation of the stress part of the nervous system constricts our blood vessels and drops finger temperature. So it was that any kind of effort is really counterproductive in that kind of skill. And that was hard. It was very stressful for me, watching my clients' finger temperature drop. It was very stressful for my clients, going like, I'm not doing it right. Look at me, I'm a failure, all that fun stuff that, we as human beings so often do to ourselves. And then I met Susan Pollack and Chris Germer, who introduced me to mindfulness. And that was kind of like magic, because suddenly, all those issues with biofeedback were solvable, right? Because as soon as I was able to encourage my clients to allow their fingers to warm up as opposed to make an effort to warm their hands, their finger temperature would just start going up. As soon as they let go of the struggle, that what they wanted to happen would just happen. So that idea of letting things be as they are and allowing their body to do what it really knows how to do was all that they actually needed. And it was a great relief because people could let go of that great effort they were putting that was futile and not getting them anywhere. So all they had to do is take a step back and let things be. So that's how I ended up in doing mindfulness and biofeedback and combining them together, because together those two provided the kind of relief that my clients really needed. And so initially, as I was training in clinical psychology, I only worked with people on kind of those clinical issues using biofeedback and using mindfulness. And then I was asked to train the psychologists who work with the Navy SEALs and, helping them improve their performance. And that's where kind of my performance side became really prominent because, the SEALs are, pretty darn great at what they do, but they are always looking for ways to do things even better. So they're using biofeedback and mindfulness skills to improve their ability to meet challenges and to optimize their activation for whatever it is that they are facing. And then also, very importantly, being able to optimize recovery so that they can be ready for whatever comes next.
Your hand warming example is such a good one. It's easy to say, drop the struggle or practice acceptance or things like that, and people say like, well, what's that going to do, maybe, or but when you literally see, like, when you start to let go of that you get this tangible result of your hands actually start warming up on their own, that I could imagine that becomes a useful metaphor for people in other areas of life too, that by letting go of that efforting, things can naturally unfold in a freer way, but also in the direction you want them to go.
Absolutely. That's one of the things I love about biofeedback is it provides us that concrete, practical example, feedback of what happens when we let go of the struggle, when we change our intention, when we become kinder to ourselves, and then things begin to happen.
Really enjoyed reading your book. What I was struck by was how practical the information is. So there's nothing arcane. And if you want to understand the physiology, you can go deeper into it, but it's very practical. There are a lot of steps that one can use to apply both biofeedback principles with or without equipment and mindfulness principles. And you also go through and get into detail about different areas of difficulty, very concrete ways in which people can approach them. So would you like to start us out with discussing the physiology of biofeedback?
Absolutely. Yeah. So our nervous system consists of the parts that are voluntary and the parts that are not voluntary. So the parts that just kind of happen without us needing to do anything, right? So there is obviously the central nervous system, which is your brain, your spinal cord. And then there is the peripheral nervous system, which is your body. And the peripheral nervous system consists of the somatic nervous system, which is the voluntary one. That's the movement of your arms, your decision to speak, any kind of movement that you make. And then there is the autonomic nervous system. That's the one that we don't need to do anything in order for it to work. So that's your heart rate and your breathing and your kidney function and your blood flow, gastrointestinal function. So all of that is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is then subdivided into the stress part, which is the sympathetic, and the relaxation part, which is the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic nervous system is the one that we need in order to activate ourselves, when we need to meet a challenge, when we need to do something, when we need to gear up a lot of energy in order to meet a challenge. And then the parasympathetic nervous system actually has more than one function. One is that ability to recover and relax. So that's what we traditionally associate with the parasympathetic nervous system. But another function that it has that we don't think about very much is actually it is the regulatory mechanism for the sympathetic activation. The sympathetic nervous system does not have a shut-off mechanism. It just kind of goes up. The shut-off mechanism is the parasympathetic brake. So as the sympathetic activation goes up, the parasympathetic nervous system comes up and puts on the brakes to that activation, leaving it at the level that is appropriate for whatever it is that we're doing, right? If we're about to run a 400-meter dash, we're going to need quite a bit of activation, right? So that sympathetic activation is going to go up quite high before the parasympathetic puts on the brakes. If we're giving a presentation, maybe there's going to be some medium rise in the sympathetic before the parasympathetic puts on the brakes. And if we're going to sleep, then there's going to be very little sympathetic activation, and most of our activation is going to be parasympathetic. And that's actually a very nice segue into the physiology of biofeedback, because most of what biofeedback is aimed at is self-regulation. And that is the ability of the parasympathetic nervous system to regulate the amount of activation that we have, overall for whatever situation is happening in that moment. So biofeedback is not a relaxation tool, just like the parasympathetic nervous system is not purely about relaxation. Biofeedback is about training our bodies and our nervous system to regulate itself. So with biofeedback, we are training the parasympathetic nervous system to put on the brakes more appropriately, because, for various reasons, whether through, adverse childhood experiences or medical issues or very stressful lives, or just, the fact that we're human, our nervous system can get a bit out of whack, and that ability to self-regulate becomes not as strong as we'd like it to be. The parasympathetic nervous system is not as able to put on the brakes as we need it to, meaning that sometimes stress activation goes too high, leaving us unable to perform at our best because we're too agitated, not able to think straight. And sometimes the parasympathetic nervous system is working too much, making us faint or pass out in stressful situations, right? So what biofeedback does is enables the parasympathetic nervous system to allow the overall sympathetic activation to reach an optimal level and then stay there.
You talk about the 5 modalities of biofeedback. Typically, we think that we don't have control over our nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
So we're sort of at the mercy of events in the absence of understanding. So the 5 modalities, as I understand them, they give us information about what's happening in our bodies. So breathing, heart rate variability, muscle tension, temperature, skin conductance.
Mm-hmm.
So what parts do we have control over? What are the levers?
Well, we have control over all of these, right? And, Alex, you make a really excellent point that, we don't need to have control over all of this, but we can. And that is what helps us do our best. One way you can think about the role of biofeedback is to think about an SLR, digital SLR camera, right? I don't know if most people have probably at least seen them, right? And it has all sorts of intimidating controls, and you can put it on auto mode, right? And if you put it on auto mode, you can take pictures. But if you learn all about those intimidating controls, or at least some of them, you can take really good pictures. That is what biofeedback does to our autonomic nervous system. If we just put it, let the autonomic nervous system go in auto mode, it will do its job. But if we learn how to regulate ourselves better, and if we learn to strengthen certain parts of the autonomic nervous system, then we can do our best. We can function our best in really difficult situations. So we don't have to, but it really helps if we can, or if we decide to learn some of those skills. And then, we can make changes to our heart rate and our heart rate variability. We can make changes to breathing, muscle tension, finger temperature, and skin conductance. All those modalities we actually have control in helpful ways that allows us to make helpful changes in a difficult situation.
Something you said a minute ago about fight or flight being the sort of activation control, and then the parasympathetic as a kind of regulatory mechanism on that. It made me think about how a lot of people equate fight or flight with bad things. Like fight or flight means panic, fight or flight means anxiety, fight or flight means, negative stuff. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, like, from the performance psychology angle, what's useful, or like how do we activate it without overactivating it, or just how you kind of explain that to people.
Absolutely. Again, a really, really excellent point, even just the word fight or flight sounds bad, right? It sounds like, bad things are happening. It sounds like we're being attacked by tigers. And, in reality, yes, that's true. The part of the brain that is responsible for the fight or flight is the one that's also kept us safe from tigers and continues to keep us safe from whatever dangers there are now. But what's also happened is we've learned to interpret sensations of sympathetic activation as being bad. Fight or flight does activate the sympathetic nervous system, which means your heart rate goes up and your breathing speeds up and you're feeling a little sweatier, and maybe your stomach is a bit upset. Maybe there are butterflies dancing in a jig in your stomach. All those things are happening, right? And that happens when you are, if you are in danger of being attacked by a tiger, or if you're thinking about a really stressful thing that's happening the next day, right? Or if you are worried about a unpleasant conversation that you have to have with a family member, right? All of that is going to happen. And we're so used to associating those sensations as signs of danger that when those same sensations come up in a performance situation, it actually leads us to unhelpful responses. For example, if we are, let's say, we are about to have a difficult conversation with a family member, right? And in reality, we do need to be a bit more activated, right? We do need to be able to focus. We need to be able to respond flexibly to whatever the other person is saying to us. We need to be able to think through our next steps quickly. We need to be able to adapt to sudden changes in our situations because we are dealing with another person, and therefore there is no way to predict exactly what's going to happen. We need to have a certain amount of physiological activation in order to perform at our best in that challenging situation. So what the body is going to do, it's going to start activating, right? It's going to speed up your heart rate a bit, and it's going to speed up your breathing, and you might feel a little bit more, your muscles might feel a little bit more tense. The body is really doing what it's supposed to be doing in order to help you be at your best in that difficult situation. But then when we feel those sensations, we're so used to labeling them as signs of danger, we're so used to labeling them as bad, that we then immediately go to, oh no, I better get rid of this. I better stop this from happening, right? And then we're working hard on relaxing or calming down, right? So we end up actually working against what the body is trying to do in order to help us. Right, so our mind and our bodies are, butting their metaphorical heads, right? And instead of working together, they're working against each other. And in that situation, what often happens is we actually end up being overactivated. Because, the body is trying to give us the kind of activation we want. The mind is trying to shut that down, but it doesn't work that way, right? So we actually end up, being even more, quote unquote, anxious, right? Where heart rate is speeding up even more. The breathing is faster, the muscles are even more tense because of that fight, right? The fight itself produces more activation, and that is too much. That activation is too much for the situation we're facing, and then we don't end up doing so well. We might, more likely to lose our temper, might more likely to say something we don't mean, or, going to say something that wasn't optimal and then go, I should have responded in some other way, right? How many of us haven't had that situation where we say something and then, 5 minutes later, like, I should have said something different. And this certainly applies to other more typical performance situations, like you're about to go on stage and give a speech to a few hundred people, right? Or if you are performing at Carnegie Hall, or if you're playing in a soccer game, any kind of performance situation requires a certain amount of physiological activation, and the body is going to give it to you, right? The body is going to increase your heart rate and your breathing, etc., because you need it, right? And this is where biofeedback is so important, because it allows that activation to reach its optimal level. But this is also where mindfulness is so incredibly important, because we need to be able to recognize that these sensations are helpful. These are sensations of activation. These are sensations of our bodies doing what they're supposed to be doing. These are sensations of our bodies helping us do our best, so that we can allow that activation to stay there. as opposed to trying to fight against.
So let's see if we can do a makeover for me. So I had to do some public speaking this morning, and I have to do some tomorrow as well. So going into the situation, I feel the activation, and so like the before picture would be I'm activated. I feel, butterflies in my stomach. My palms are sweating. I'm thinking, oh no. I try to do some deep breathing and kind of get in the zone or something. But then by the time I'm there, I'm like, busy and shaky, and, it doesn't go awful, but there's a feeling of like, I could probably do this in a more calm way, but there's sort of like you're saying, there's that fight back and forth between, on the one hand, like my body's activating itself. On the other hand, my brain is saying like, do your relaxation exercises, Kate. Like, so what's the after picture look like? What would be an intervention that might help a person, myself, handle a situation like that sort of respects that the body's activating, but also kind of like there's this fear that it's going to keep getting overactivated if I don't do something?
The what to do is actually incredibly simple. The what to do is quite literally recognizing that all those sensations of activation are helpful and adaptive. That's all. There's been a whole bunch of research showing that, just very brief discussions, just like the one we had now, talking about how important that activation is in order for us to do our best, is all that's necessary in order for people to learn to let go of that fight. That you recognize the speeding up of the heart rate and the breathing and the sweatiness and the butterflies in the stomach, and you go, okay, that's my body doing what it needs to do to help me do my best. You might even sometimes interpret this as excitement, public speaking, if the topic you're discussing or the venue you're at is something that it does provide some excitement for you, then that is legitimately what is actually happening, right? If you're excited, sensations of excitement are subjectively no different from sensations of what we call anxiety. It all feels the same. There are some subtle differences if it were to really get down to measuring things, but we don't really perceive those differences, right? To us, all those differences are, all those sensations are pretty much the same. So allow yourself to interpret those sensations of activation in the helpful way, which is that, this is excitement, or this is my body doing what it needs to be doing to help me do my best. And then, there are actually some really cool things that happen when you just say those words. You don't even have to totally believe them, by the way. It still works, even if you don't totally believe them. But if you go through this in your mind, then your body starts responding in healthier ways. For example, when you interpret sensations of physiological activation as helpful and adaptive, your coronary blood vessels don't constrict as much than if you interpret those sensations as signs of danger. And your cardiac efficiency is higher, meaning that your heart doesn't need to work as hard in order to provide you with the extra energy you need in that situation, right? So this is a much healthier physiological response, right? Your blood vessels don't get constricted, meaning that your blood pressure doesn't go up so much, and your heart doesn't have to work as hard, meaning that there is less wear and tear on your heart. And very interestingly, even the hormones that your body produces in those moments are different, right? So there is a hormone that we typically associate with stress, which is cortisol, and it helps us maintain higher levels of activation. And there is another hormone, which is also a stress hormone that we don't hear as much about, and it's called DHEA. And we have to have an optimal ratio of cortisol to DHEA. And again, that practice of interpreting physiological sensations as helpful and adaptive gives us a better chance of having an optimal ratio of cortisol versus DHEA, meaning a little more DHEA, a little less cortisol, than in the opposite situation, where if we interpret those sensations as danger and bad for us, there's more cortisol and less DHEA. DHEA is the one that actually counteracts the potentially negative effects of cortisol. So having more DHEA, again, is producing a healthier physiological response for our bodies. And then, what also, if you try this, Kate, if you try this tomorrow, you just allow yourself to feel how you feel, and then say to yourself, out loud or silently to yourself, this is my body doing what it needs to do to help me do my best. You will likely notice a change in your experience. You will likely notice that it will, you'll feel a little bit more confident, and you'll feel a little bit readier for the performance. And afterwards, you're likely to feel like you've actually done better. You may not feel more relaxed, because relaxation is not necessary here, right? If you're going up, if you're doing your public speaking and you're super relaxed, you might not do so well for a different reason, right? Because you're kind of sluggish and not enough energy, and maybe you're not looking or connecting at the audience, or you're not thinking very quickly in response to questions, right? So you don't actually want to be relaxed. You want to have an optimal level of activation, which is much more likely to happen, again, if you let your body do what it knows how to do.
That's such a good point, because I think there is this tendency that we have to think like, oh, I should just, be able to float up there in the calmest, most peaceful place. But like you're saying, that you need to be a little activated to perform well.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes back a little bit to dropping the struggle and accepting this, that your body is doing something to be helpful, which makes me also think about self-compassion, because it's making me naturally think like, oh, thank you, body. Like, how cool. Thank you for that. And there's like a moment of self-kindness there, of like appreciation.
Absolutely. Yes. I really, really like the idea of bringing compassion into that moment, right? So not just saying kind of pragmatically, hey, my body is doing what it needs to be doing, but also being grateful and recognizing that it is really cool that your body knows just what to do in that situation, and it is being helpful.
Do you see other connections between sort of biofeedback, mindfulness, and self-compassion?
Oh, lots of them. I mean, there is a direct connection between compassion and heart rate variability, for example. So let me segue again into a bit of physiology to explain what heart rate variability is. Heart variability is the difference in time that passes from heartbeat to heartbeat. So if you were to take your pulse, you would feel a thump, 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 right? So each one of those thumps is a heartbeat. It's the left ventricle of your heart contracting and sending blood out to your body. And you might have, say 65 of those thumps in a minute, which means that your heart rate is 65 beats per minute. But within that minute, the time that passes from one of those heartbeats to the next is constantly changing. So within that minute, your heart rate is constantly speeding up and slowing down, speeding up and slowing down. And we want that. We want the heart rate variability to be as high as possible, because it is an indication of cardiovascular health, and it is an indication of psychophysiological health. It is truly an indication of our ability to self-regulate, right? Because sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the heart rate going up, and the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for the heart rate going down. So it is an interplay of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system working together in order to regulate the level of activation we're at. So heart rate variability is one of the most important training tools we have for various psychophysiological issues like high blood pressure, chronic pain, and anxiety, and for helping people improve performance through improving self-regulation. Right, and we also know that there is a direct relationship between compassion, self-compassion, and heart rate variability. So people who have higher heart rate variability are better able to express compassion towards others and towards themselves. And heart rate variability is associated with more compassionate actions, not just kind of more compassionate thoughts or feelings, right? So people are more likely to act in compassionate ways when their heart rate variability is higher. One of the underlying reasons for this is the self-regulation. If we are not able to regulate ourselves, it's actually harder to be compassionate to ourselves or towards others, right? If we're feeling dysregulated, if we're feeling like there is danger all around, we're not going to be thinking about how can I be kind to myself. And it's actually going to be harder to be compassionate towards other people, because naturally the instinct is going to be to kind of protect ourselves and keep ourselves safe. So with higher heart variability, we're better able to express the compassion that we would frequently experience.
So with your book, you're combining two very separate traditions, biofeedback and mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And as you write, there's an apparent contradiction between the acceptance of mindfulness and the change orientation of biofeedback. Could you talk about how they fit together? What's the division of labor?
Yeah, I like that division of labor. I really like that term here. Certainly. As you said, on the surface, the two seem to be incompatible. Mindfulness is all about allowing things to be, and biofeedback is all about making changes. But if we think about, what is the purpose of, the mindfulness practice or any kind of self-care practices that we employ, right? The idea is for us to improve how things happen in the future. This is where biofeedback and mindfulness play off of each other really well. I think the best way to illustrate it is to talk about the story of Sona, the parable of the lute, which is an ancient Buddhist story that it really beautifully illustrates the way that mindfulness and biofeedback fit together. So I will briefly tell that story. Sona was a son of a rich businessman in ancient India, and Sona decided that he would like to achieve enlightenment, and he's going to abandon his earthly possessions, and he's going to go off and he's going to meditate, and he would like to achieve enlightenment as a result. So he went off and he meditated and he tried really hard, and he worked at it, and he didn't feel like he got anywhere. So he sought out the Buddha, and he asked the Buddha, tell me, what am I doing wrong? I've been working so hard, I've been doing all the things I'm supposed to be doing, and I can't get where I'd like to go. So the Buddha knew that Sona was a skilled lute player. So the Buddha asked Sona, when you play your lute and the strings are too loose, can you play the lute well? Sona says, no, it doesn't sound very good. Okay, so then if you are playing your lute and the strings are too tight, can you play the lute well then? So Sona said, no, it doesn't sound very good then either. And if the strings of the lute are just right, not too tight, not too loose, can you play the lute well then? And Sona said, yeah, that's when the lute sounds beautiful. That's when it sounds the best. And so the Buddha says, so there you go, Sona. Here is the middle way between letting go and goal-directed action. So the letting go is the mindfulness, and the goal-directed action is the biofeedback, where we have to find just the right balance of letting things be, but then being able to act in a purposeful manner in order to achieve our long-term goals. Whether it be enlightenment or things that we as human beings are slightly more typically aiming for.
Now, in both apparently physical problems like physical pain and also emotional problems or difficulties people have, like anxiety, there seems to be a common core. And you talk about getting unstuck from so-called negative emotions. I wonder if you can say a few things about that.
Sure. Yeah, you're hitting all my favorite topics.
Great.
This is great.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the idea of getting unstuck, so often we perceive those so-called negative emotions as bad for us, right? So often we read in the media, anxiety is bad for you, depression is going to kill you, right? Anger is toxic, all this, we have a lot of fear with respect to experiencing emotions, which are actually completely normal, human, helpful emotions, right? Think about what would happen if we didn't experience anxiety, or what would happen if we didn't have any sadness, right? Or if anger didn't come into play, right? All those emotions have a very important role, both in our survival, evolutionarily speaking, and in our ability to live healthy, productive, meaningful lives, right? If we didn't feel anger, what would happen if we see somebody being mistreated, right? Would we want that to happen? If we didn't have sadness, how would we be able to miss a dear friend that we haven't seen in a long time? Or would we really notice the importance of people that may not be with us at this moment? So all those emotions are absolutely normal, human, and very importantly helpful. They just again have this bad rap as being bad for us. So a big part of what we need to do is change our experience and change our interpretation of the presence of these emotions, which will then allow us to act in more helpful ways. So a metaphor that I really like to use when talking about this is a metaphor that I borrowed from the acceptance and commitment therapy, the metaphor of quicksand, right? We probably all know what quicksand is. It's a mixture of water and sand that, if we step into it, it kind of sucks us in and gets us stuck, right? So imagine
the movies.
Exactly. Yes. If you've seen The Princess Bride or Lawrence of Arabia, right? It portrays quicksand as this horribly dangerous thing, right? So we're going to come back to that point in a minute. But imagine you're walking around and suddenly you step into quicksand and you sink up to your ankles. What's going to be the first thing that you're going to try to do? You're going to try to get yourself out of there. And as soon as you lift one of your feet out, two things happen. One is actually that movement liquefies the sand some more, so you end up sinking more. And now, because only one of your feet is in contact with the quicksand, the overall surface area that's in contact with the quicksand is smaller. Therefore, the pressure on the quicksand is greater, so that makes you sink, right? And then you are stuck, right? Here's an interesting part about quicksand that I did not know until I started researching quicksand, is that it is actually rarely more than a couple of feet deep. Right? So it's actually impossible to drown in it. So, those scary scenes in The Princess Bride and Lawrence of Arabia, that's extremely unlikely, right? We're just not going to sink in quicksand, but we could get stuck. Right? And if we're stuck, then we are exposed to the elements, right? Maybe there is harsh sun, or maybe there's cold, there is no water, there is no food, there is wild animals running around, there's all sorts of dangers. It's not the quicksand itself that's the problem or the danger, it's the being stuck in it that creates a dangerous situation for us. Right? So actually something very similar happens with our emotions, right? When we first encounter, say, fear or anger or sadness, right? Our first desire, our first temptation is, oh, let me get rid of this. I shouldn't feel this way, right? So then we struggle to try not to feel that way, but it doesn't work, right? I imagine that, all of us know what it's like to try not to feel something, right? We just can't do it. And most of the time, the more we try, the worse the feeling gets. So we end up getting stuck. And again, just like with quicksand, all those emotions are actually not bad for us, right? We talked about this. Our body is built for experiencing fear and sadness and anger. It's okay for us to have those feelings. The problem comes if we get stuck in them. And so if we're fighting with our anxiety, if we're fighting with the sadness, if we're fighting with the anger, then we're much more likely to get stuck. And that is where the danger comes. So all those studies showing, how bad, chronic anger is for us, or anxiety that happens over the long term, or, or sadness that turns into long-term depression. All of these studies that show bad long-term health effects are talking about chronic feelings, and those feelings happen when we get stuck in them. It is okay for us to have a moment or a prolonged moment of fear. If we allow ourselves not to get stuck in it, there is going to be no negative consequences to that long term. It's the getting stuck that's dangerous, right? So if we're coming back to quicksand for a moment, what's the best way to get out of quicksand? And that's to lie down on it, right? If we lie down on quicksand, quicksand is actually very dense, right? Because it's a mixture of water and sand. It's more dense than seawater, right? And we've all, probably most of us, have floated on seawater, right? So we know that it kind of holds us up. So the quicksand is going to be even better at holding us up while floating. And the surface area in contact with the quicksand, if we're lying down, is going to be much greater than if we are standing up in it, right? So the pressure on the quicksand is going to be much lower, and that's going to allow us to just float and be able to paddle or get pulled to safety, and then be able to move on. And it's the same thing with our emotions. If we open ourselves up to those emotions, if we let go of the struggle, if we allow ourselves to feel how we feel and let those emotions be in the present moment, then the emotions are there, and then they run their course, and then we're able to move on with our lives without getting stuck. It's the struggle that's the problem, not the emotions themselves.
So when we relate to the anxiety of an interview or sadness of losing a loved one as an affliction, as unfair problem, and we get into a struggle with it, the struggle itself becomes unhealthy and problematic.
Exactly. Yeah. You think about it, if you've lost somebody you've really loved, how can you possibly not feel sad? And even more importantly, would you want to not feel sad over losing somebody you love, right? What kind of person would that be? Right? This always makes me think about, Star Trek, The Next Generation, Data, right? Who, kept striving towards feeling human emotions, right? We might try so hard to rid ourselves of these emotions, but their emotions are actually what makes us human. And if we think about it, do we want to get rid of them? I think for most of us, we would probably say no. We just don't want to get stuck in them.
Your chapter on sadness, I found very poignant. The lessons, the messages that sadness has for us. You present a step-by-step flare technique to help people relate to experiences differently. And also, you talk about the low and slow breathing, which sounds like a really precious tool.
Certainly. If it's okay with you, let me start with the breathing, and then I'll transition into flare, because breathing will be a part of that. So low and slow breathing is a really helpful technique when we are feeling perhaps a bit overstimulated or a bit overwhelmed, and there is a little bit too much going on. And the low and slow breathing is aimed at providing us with a healthy physiological respiratory chemistry, so healthy respiratory chemistry in the moment of feeling overactivated or overwhelmed. We typically think of breathing in terms of deep breathing, right? If we have a difficult time, if we find ourselves in a difficult situation, if we're feeling really anxious or scared, what we hear most of the time is like, oh, just take a deep breath, right? And that is actually a really big misconception and an unhelpful thing to do a lot of the time, because it creates an unhealthy respiratory physiology. Most of the time, the intention behind deep breathing is the need, or the idea that we need more oxygen, right? In order for us to come down, we need to get more oxygen.
So when you say a deep breath, you mean like a big inhale kind of breath? Is that?
Yes. So the deep breath that you typically see people do, this really, really big inhalation, yes, and then just like you did, that quick exhalation, right? So, as I'll talk about in a moment, it's that quick exhalation that's the problem. So it's not technically a deep breath itself that's the problem. It's the way we take it that is the problem. And the reality is that at rest, if we're not physically exerting ourselves, if we're sitting or kind of walking or going about our kind of daily lives without a lot of extra activation, we don't need any extra oxygen. There is 21% oxygen in the air we breathe in at sea level. There is 15 to 16% oxygen in the air we breathe out. This is given healthy lungs, healthy hearts. It's in the situation where somebody's heart or lungs are not entirely healthy, same principles apply, but it's a little bit trickier. But with healthy lungs, healthy heart, there's 15 to 16% oxygen you're breathing out. So the point is, you're only using about a quarter of the oxygen that you are taking in, meaning you have plenty of it. You do not need any more oxygen. What is counterintuitive that most people don't think about is, in order for us to then use that oxygen that we have plenty of, we actually need to conserve our carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is crucial for distribution of oxygen. If we don't have enough carbon dioxide in our bloodstream, it prevents the oxygen that we have from getting to where it needs to go. Right, carbon dioxide is a really important determinant of our pH level, and pH level is the determinant of the release of oxygen from the blood. So without enough carbon dioxide, our blood becomes too alkaline, and then the oxygen keeps going around in the bloodstream, bound to the hemoglobin without getting released in sufficient quantities to the brain, to muscles, to other major organs that actually need the oxygen. Right. So in our attempts to come down and get more oxygen, we end up depriving ourselves of oxygen because of those really big, effortful, forceful breaths that we take. So we take a really big breath in, and then that really quick, big exhale that you breathe out massive amounts of carbon dioxide, which lowers the amounts of carbon dioxide in your blood and then leads to this lack of oxygen in your brain, your muscles, your organs. And that leads to sensations like lightheadedness and tingly feet and fingers, shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, having trouble thinking straight, kind of fuzzy mind, butterflies in the stomach, nausea, gastrointestinal distress. So all of those symptoms are symptoms of so-called overbreathing, meaning breathing out too much carbon dioxide. So in that suggestion of take a deep breath, if we don't exhale slowly enough, which particularly in stressful situations, we usually don't, right? Only because we're so focused on that inhalation, right? We're so focused on taking that big, deep breath in, and we're not focusing on the exhalation. We end up achieving the exact opposite of what we're trying to do. So the low and slow breathing provides us with a breathing skill that will decrease the intensity of difficult situations, that will help us think a little bit more clearly, that will help us figure out, what to do in a difficult situation, that will provide our brain and muscles and all the other organs with the oxygen that they need. And so, low and slow breathing emphasizes the exhalation as opposed to the inhalation, right? So the idea is to shift your breath from the chest to the belly, that's the low part, and then to slow down your inhalation and exhalation, that's the slow part. Right? So you take a normal size, comfortable breath in, letting the breath go all the way down to the belly, and then you breathe out as slowly as you comfortably can, either through the nose or through pursed lips, as if you're blowing out a candle. So normal size inhalation, not particularly deep, not particularly large. There's no need to emphasize the size or the depth of that breath at all. Kind of like, maybe if you're smelling a flower, right? So breathing in and then breathing out as if you're blowing out a candle, as slow as you possibly can. In that situation, you're breathing out the same amount of CO2 over a longer period of time, allowing the CO2 to remain stable in your blood, and then that oxygen that you have is going to get distributed in the most optimal way. So that's the low and slow breathing, and I can now talk about the flare.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Right, so the flare technique puts together a lot of mindfulness and biofeedback physiology-based skills in a structured way. One thing I found over the years is if I teach my clients, all those skills, there's lots of things that have been shown in research to be effective, that people find effective when they're practicing them. But then if they find themselves in a difficult situation and they try to implement their skills, they kind of go, wait, which one do I use and what's most helpful? And it's, the situation's already stressful. They're already not thinking most clearly. That doesn't work. So the flare walks people through the most helpful skills in a structured way, and if they practice those steps in fairly neutral situations, and when they find themselves in a difficult, challenging situation, that skill is already practiced. They don't really need to think too much about what to do. They just kind of go through the steps. So FLAIR stands for F for feel, L for label, A for allow, R for respond, and E for expand awareness. The F, the feel, is really just that pre-verbal sensory experience of what's happening in the moment, right? Maybe before a speech, you find yourself feeling the butterflies in your stomach and the faster heart rate and the faster breathing, a little sweaty, a little more agitated, right? So that's the experience. So that's the purely mindful part, pre-verbal experience of the present moment. Here it is. That's the F. And then the L is labeling. When we find ourselves in difficult situations, the part of the brain that gets the most activated is the fear center, the amygdala, right? The fight or flight center of the brain. And when that happens, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for problem solving and decision making and ability to choose helpful action, becomes less activated. And that's a recipe for automatic action, for doing things that are not well thought through, perhaps doing or saying things that we didn't actually mean to do or say. So we know from imaging studies that giving a label to our experience in that moment reverses that unhelpful activation, right? So labeling that experience, that physiological experience that I described as, say, activation or discomfort, or even fear or worry, right? A short, descriptive, non-judgmental label reverses that activation, whereas the fight or flight center of the brain becomes less activated and the prefrontal cortex becomes more activated, and particularly the part of the prefrontal cortex that's responsible for choosing action and emotion regulation become more active, right? And so now your prefrontal cortex is able to put on the brakes to the fight or flight activation, allowing the intensity of the difficult situation to come down. It doesn't take away the problem, it doesn't make it go away, but it reduces the intensity, and it allows us to activate the thinking part of the brain so that we can now choose how to respond to the situation rather than approaching it in an automatic way. So that's the labeling part. A stands for allow, and that's the letting go of the struggle, right? If we notice our physiological sensations, but then go, oh no, but I must make this go away, we still end up in trouble, right? So if we notice and label our sensations and then just allow ourselves to feel how they feel, it is okay to feel this way. It's okay to have this experience. That's allowing. I mean, it's not like we have a choice, right? Our feelings are not under our control. The best thing that we can do is let those feelings be, right? So open ourselves up, in that, as a quicksand metaphor, open ourselves up to the feelings so that we don't get stuck, giving up the struggle so we don't get stuck. And then all those resources that would have gone towards the fight that we are not going to be able to win, right? If we were to try to make our feelings go away, we're going to be directing our emotional, mental, physiological resources towards a fight that we cannot win. And then those resources wouldn't be available towards an action that is under our control. So by allowing our experience to be as it is, we are freeing up all those resources to be used for things that are under our control, which is how do we respond to the situation? That's the R in FLAIR. Which response is in my best interest here? It may be something as simple as something practical. If I'm feeling really worried about a test that I have tomorrow that I haven't studied for, the best thing to do is, take some breaths and go study. Of course, most of the time things are not quite so simple. A lot of the time we're, thinking about something that's in the past or something that we are anticipating in the future that we cannot really do anything practical about, or maybe we're comparing ourselves to other people in unfavorable ways. So here, the response, rather than going with the automatic, beating up on ourselves or getting stuck in worry or playing through scenarios of all the bad things that can happen, instead, a helpful response might be taking some low and slow breaths. A helpful response might be using our self-compassion practices. A helpful response might be holding onto a stone and just allowing ourselves to feel grounded and present in the moment. A helpful response might be deciding that, my plan for solving this problem is going to include A, B, and C, right? The point is that when we get to that response part, our brain activation is now one that allows us to choose an action. Our resources are devoted towards being able to, implement that action, and then we're much more likely to choose a helpful response as opposed to the unhelpful automatic stuff that would otherwise happen.
Right.
And we're able to expand our awareness. That's the E in FLAIR, right? The E and the R can sometimes almost be one and the same. They can happen together, or sometimes the E becomes part of the R, or sometimes we choose our response and then we expand awareness before implementing the response. So the sequence there is sometimes a little bit fuzzy. But the idea of expanding awareness is to take the sharp focus off the problem and allow ourselves to see that problem as part of our experience, not all of our experience.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, being able to step away and notice, okay, here's this worry I have about my job interview tomorrow. But, here's also, my children sitting in front of me, and here is the floor underneath my feet, and here's the plant in the corner of the room, and here's the sky, and here's my breath, and here is my heart rate, my heartbeat, and here is my itchy nose, right? All these things are happening together. And there's worry about the job interview, but the focus is no longer just sharply, oh my God, this job interview, everything is kind of colored by this worry. Instead, so many things are happening, positive, challenging, neutral, and that worry is just a part of the experience.
In the third section of your book, each chapter is devoted to a different common challenge, like sleep difficulties, anxiety, sadness, chronic pain. I wonder, are there some that are instructive, that may be unexpected for people that you'd like to share?
Sure. Well, perhaps something that Kate had brought up earlier is interpersonal relationships. We often, don't think about biofeedback, applying to that, or even this, maybe not even mindfulness, because we tend to think of those as something that's more relevant to each individual person. But both of these are very relevant to our interactions with other people. If you think about what happens, when we have a difficult conversation, there's so many ways this could go wrong because we don't have, not only do we not have control over our feelings, but we really don't have control over the other person's feelings or their actions, right? They're gonna respond in some way. They're gonna say things. They're gonna do things, and we have to respond to that right in the moment, in very ideally in flexible and adaptive ways. And that's really hard. If our bodies are not able to regulate that activation, right? And if the parasympathetic nervous system is a bit out of whack and it's not able to put on the brakes to that stress activation appropriately, we might get overly activated, right? We might get snappy or respond in some really unhelpful automatic way. We might act out in anger in ways that are not helpful. We might say things we don't mean. So biofeedback training helps regulate the physiological activation that we experience in that moment, so that we're better able to pause long enough to choose a helpful response, so that our activation stays at the optimal level and it doesn't go overboard. And then, of course, with mindfulness skills, we, especially if our bodies are well regulated, then we're able to use our mindfulness skills to reflect on what is the intention of the person I'm speaking with. When they are saying, I've had such a hard day, do they mean, to call me lazy, that I haven't done anything for them? Or are they just trying to tell me that they've had a hard day and they would like a hug, right? So we're much better able to think that through and then respond in appropriate ways, and not just immediately react according to what might be going on for us, potentially leading to unhelpful interactions.
So how might that biofeedback part look as it relates to an interpersonal situation? Is it that you do some biofeedback with a professional in an office, and then those skills kind of generalize and you can use them in your life? Or are there actually tools you can use in that very moment to help you kind of stay at that right level of activation?
It's actually both. And this applies to all situations, not just interpersonal. So with biofeedback training, you would acquire the skills say, in the office with a professional, or there are certainly ways you can do biofeedback on your own without working with a professional. But you do that training at neutral times on a regular basis, the same way that you would, for example, with strength training, right? If you go to the gym and you throw around some kettlebells and, you do some, pull-ups and some push-ups, and you strengthen your muscles, right? And you don't need to keep those kettlebells with you in order to maintain your muscle mass and muscle strength, right? As long as you keep getting to the gym, say, I don't know, you do your half-hour workout 3 times a week, you continue making progress, and you continue maintaining the progress that you've made. And then, after working out, let's say for, a couple of months, a friend asked you to help them move a couch. And, when now you can lift that couch or, your end of that couch without having to do anything special, right? That increased muscle strength that you've been working out for the last couple of months is now there, and you're able to use it. So biofeedback skills work in that same way. You've been doing your, say, heart rate variability breathing for 15, 20 minutes a day, most days a week for, a couple of months, and then you're faced with a challenging situation, having an unpleasant conversation with your boss, or, having a presentation to give or a job interview, and your nervous system has gotten stronger. Your ability to self-regulate has gotten stronger over those couple of months. So now you may not even need to do anything special. Rather, you're able to respond in more helpful, more flexible, more resilient ways in the moment. And at the same time, you can also use those biofeedback skills if you do need them in the moment. Because, of course, there will be times when it feels like, things are still, maybe a little bit too intense, or you're having trouble figuring out how to respond, and you would like to just remind your body how to regulate itself a little bit better in that moment. So you can use those same skills in the moment, just pausing for a minute or two, because you've been using the biofeedback skills for a while now. Your body is easily reminded. If you just shift your breath in that certain way, your body knows exactly what is that a reminder of, and your body is able to shift into that better way of regulating, so you can help yourself in the moment, as well as having that foundation.
So something like that low and slow breathing or something like that would be available in the moment.
Exactly.
So we thought we'd move towards wrapping up, but just with a couple more practical questions. One is about as we're listening to you talk, I know it's starting to feel like this stuff seems really super useful and pragmatic. And it also seems like there's, as you're saying, there's stuff available that doesn't require visits with a professional, and things that people can do at home. And I know I've heard of different technologies that are available for purchase and things like that. What might you recommend somebody start with for something like that? Whether it's a device or something they can use at home on the fly. And then moving into, if somebody did want to do biofeedback with a professional, what might that look like a course of treatment?
Certainly. I mean, one of the simplest things that you can do is learn to do low and slow breathing that does not require a device. And if you'd like to include some aspects of heart rate variability training into that, it's possible to do that without a device. You can, if you do low and slow breathing at 6 breaths per minute, meaning that you breathe in for 4 seconds and you breathe out for 6 seconds. So that's 10 seconds per breath, or 6 breaths per minute. That will approximate an ideal breathing rate that will maximize your heart rate variability. It's not quite as good as actually calculating that ideal breathing rate, which is possible to do with a device and best done with a professional. But that would be a whole lot better than not doing any of that at all. So there is some research that shows that, for example, breathing at 6 breaths per minute is better than just slow breathing, although it may not be quite as good as actually calculating that ideal breathing rate that will maximize your heart rate variability. So this is a very simple way that you can get going on some of these skills. There are pacers. Most of them are free that you can get on your mobile device. Just make sure that the pacer you get allows you to set your inhalation and exhalation rate, not just the overall breathing rate. So you can go 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out. Give yourself a little bit of time to be able to slow down that much. I mean, this is much slower breathing than what most people are used to. So it's okay to not feel comfortable doing that right away. And remember not to take big breaths. Even though the breathing is slower, it might be tempting to take a really big breath to be able to breathe in for 4 seconds. Don't do that, because that will that will likely mean that you're going to breathe out too much carbon dioxide and overbreathe and feel bad. Right? So the idea is just to take a normal size, breath in for those 4 seconds without attempting to take too much air, and then just breathe out slowly for 6 seconds. And you can do that with one of those pacers. There are also apps that are free or virtually free on mobile devices that will measure your heart rate variability. There are some fitness trackers that will do that as well. You do have to be careful. Not all apps do a good job, and not all fitness trackers necessarily do a good job with heart rate variability because it requires a certain specific way of measuring it. The sampling rate has to be fast enough, and not all devices and not all apps are quite up to par. But there are some good ones out there that are like either free or inexpensive, or something that you might already have that you could use to measure your heart rate variability. And if you'd like to really do some training and say calculate your ideal breathing rate that will maximize your heart rate variability, or to do some other kind of biofeedback, the best way to find a well-trained professional is to go on the website for Biofeedback Certification International Alliance. That's bcia.org. And they have a find a practitioner function where you just enter the state you live in, and it will give you all the practitioners who are certified in biofeedback in your state, and you can find somebody who hopefully is close to that you can get to. One thing to be careful there are several different kinds of biofeedback certifications. So BCB, by Board Certified in Biofeedback, is the kind of biofeedback that I was talking about. There is also a designation BCN, that's Board Certified in Neurofeedback. Neurofeedback is a special kind of biofeedback that's working with brainwaves that I've not talked about today. And then there is also pelvic floor biofeedback certification, which is quite different. It's working on the pelvic muscles for situations like incontinence or vaginal pain and things like that. Not usually done not by mental health professionals, but by occupational and physical therapists. So that designation is BCB PMB. If you look for a practitioner on the BCIA website, you'll find a mix of all those three. So just find the one that you're looking for.
So that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Ina. This has been a really lovely conversation and inspiring to think about all the ways that we can really, support and help ourselves using these biofeedback tools along with mindfulness. So if people want to engage with you or your work any further, how can they reach out to you, or what offerings do you have in the world that people might like to be part of?
You can find me on my website, and it's just inakhazan.org. You can also bostonhealthpsychology.com. It points to the same exact website, different names, whatever you remember. Boston Health Psychology may be a little easier to remember the spelling to than my name. So find me on my website, and my website has some resources, including meditation recordings that you can download for free. Talks about what is biofeedback and mindfulness in some ways that people can use them in their lives.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for listening today. This podcast was brought to you by the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the integration of mindfulness, meditation, and psychotherapy. For more information, visit meditationandpsychotherapy.org.